Let's take you back to one of our top stories, which is all about the quest for a ceasefire, some kind of peace in Ukraine. The talks that are on in Riyadh between, well, US and Moscow today, but before that, even Kyiv and Washington had talked on Sunday. I'm joined for now by Vasilin Popovsky, former head of Peace and Governance Program, UN University, Tokyo. Thank you for joining us, Professor Popovsky. What do you make of the effort that is ongoing right now on the part of the US to somehow find common ground between Moscow and Kyiv, which has been extremely tough?
Separate ceasefire from long-term peace. What is the negotiations currently going on in Saudi Arabia is to achieve a temporary ceasefire over 30 days. In fact, a week ago, the United States came with a proposal which Ukraine accepted unconditionally to cover every land, sea, and airspace. Russia refused that, and they limited the ceasefire only to cover the energy infrastructure. Currently in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia, we're expecting to hear what will happen between the talks. Yesterday, there was a talk between United States and Ukraine, which will continue over the next days. But in parallel, in the same place, in Riyadh, there will be conversation also between a Russian delegation and United States.
Right. We're also joined
Obviously,
by...
I would think that...
Go ahead. Please complete what you were saying.
I think ceasefire is possible. A temporary ceasefire is possible. It remains to be negotiated as to what exactly will be covered. Certainly energy infrastructure is already agreed, possibly also the freedom of passage through the Black Sea, the shipments exporting Ukrainian and Russian grain exports could be also protected by the ceasefire. The question remains whether Russia will agree also to cover the rest of the targets. And we just saw in your pictures a minute ago show that in Sumy there was a civilian target hit with a lot of 60 people being injured. Over the weekend there were a hit in Kiev, in the capital of Ukraine, with a family with a 5-year-old daughter being killed. So someone probably should stop shooting when they go to negotiate ceasefire.
Yes, that would be helpful, I guess, but it's not happening for the time being. Ambassador Mohan Kumar also joins us. He's a former senior diplomat. He's been India's ambassador to France, among holding many other positions of responsibility. Good evening, Professor Mohan Kumar. What do you make of Ambassador Mohan Kumar? Now, what do you make of this effort where clearly the US manages to get Ukraine to agree to certain things that they are willing to concede, and when it comes to having Russia meet it, around the same points in agreement, that seems to be more difficult to muster.
I agree with your assessment, Gautam. My sense is that a 30-day ceasefire was proposed to the Ukrainians yesterday, and the Ukrainians accepted it unconditionally, gave the Americans a list of infrastructure points that they said should not be attacked by Russia. And when the Americans met with Russia today, the conversation seems to be focused not so much on the 30-day ceasefire, but as Professor Popovsky was saying, they are talking about a maritime security deal or a maritime ceasefire deal, which is known as the Black Sea Grain Initiative. The reason why the Russians are keen on the Black Sea Grain Initiative is because it will enable the Ukrainians to send grains, but it will also equally enable the Russians to export farm produce and fertilizers and thereby get an exemption from the sanctions. That seems to be Russia's main objective. It's
But the US does
possible
not.
the
But the US does not
Russians
seem to be offering.
eventually.
The
Sorry?
US does not seem to be offering any waiver of sanctions at the moment, is it?
Well, if they accept a Black Sea maritime security deal, they would be giving Russians an exemption because that way Russia can export farm produce and fertilizers through the Black
Yes,
Sea
because the last time
grain
the
route.
agreement, the Russia walked out of it because it said that it's not getting a benefit of letting Ukraine export its grain because it was still under sanctions. Its own exports were still under sanctions.
Correct. So I think right now it is not direct talks between Russia and Ukraine, but proximity shuttle diplomacy by the Americans. They're talking to the two delegations separately. At some point, I'll be surprised if they don't agree to a 30-day deal. But I think the devil is in the details. What happens after is the problem because we don't know whether that will go on to a permanent ceasefire. There will then have to be discussions about peacekeeping. Then finally, some kind of a settlement which could be land for peace. So I think this is just the beginning, and I see a long road ahead in terms of talks. I don't think this is finishing anytime soon.
Professor Popovsky, do you feel that here there is an imbalance really in terms of the US mediating this entire situation because it has a lot of leverage where Ukraine is concerned? With Russia, it's limited. There are sanctions, of course, that it could offer to waive, but in terms of putting added pressure, so far the US is refraining from doing any of that. Professor Popovsky, can you hear me? It seems he is unable to hear me at the moment. Could you answer that question, Ambassador Mohan Kumar?
I would have to reluctantly agree with you, Gautam. I think right now it seems to me the US is keeping the leverage back vis-a-vis the United States and is using the leverage vis-a-vis Ukraine. Maybe there is a strategy to it, or maybe there is a preconceived notion of what the final agreement should look like, but we will know in the days to come. But as of now, I think it appears to me the Ukrainians seem more keen on a ceasefire than the Russians, and the Russian position seems to be that some of the underlying causes of the conflict need to be resolved before they can agree to a ceasefire. The Russians maintain that they have accepted President Trump's suggestion not to target critical energy infrastructure. But whether other civilian infrastructure will be spared or not, I'm not in a position to say. Both sides have accused each other of firing several drones on each other. So we have actually a war which is ongoing, frankly, but in parallel, the question is whether both sides can agree to a 30-day ceasefire, at least on air, maritime, and sea, so that thereafter the sides can then get on with a permanent ceasefire.
Do you feel that the sense of urgency that you say Ukraine has to get to some sort of a ceasefire, partial or maybe further extended, does Russia share that sense of urgency, or do you feel that Russia is engaging at the moment to just get some concessions from the US and perhaps even the West, the larger West, which is not even part of the talks? And apart from that, just looking to keep the war going on, the special operation, special military operation going on, and meet its objectives militarily.
Two things are going on, Gautam. I think one, President Zelensky got off on the back foot with President Trump. You remember the Oval House meeting,
Yeah, it
which
seemed to
there
be
was
on
a
the wrong
complete
foot.
meltdown in the talks between President Zelensky and then President, where the Vice President J.D. Vance intervened and it just collapsed. So there was an eagerness on the part of Ukraine and on President Zelensky to get on to the right side of President Trump quickly, because they realized that without the United States, they will be in deep trouble. So they may have accepted the offer of a 30-day ceasefire unconditionally post haste. And that seems to have happened in Ukraine's case because Ukraine is also keen to paint to the US that they are not the problem to a ceasefire. It is the Russians who are actually stopping the ceasefire. On the face of it, their argument seems to be right because Russia has not said no to the ceasefire, but they're not saying yes. They're saying yes, but. And then there are a number of other nuanced conditions that the Russians are putting forward. It has to be said that the Russians are very, very tough negotiators. Putin is a tough negotiator, and I think he's pushing the right buttons when it comes to the United States and President Trump.
And do you think there are other factors as well that could queer the pitch further? I mean, there's Europe, which has been left completely out at this stage. It might tell Ukraine that, look, you keep holding on to your position and we'll back you to the hilt. Today we heard of Putin having a chat with his UAE counterpart, thanking him for the soldier exchanges. So the UAE has a stake in the whole process. Then, of course, there's Iran, which is suddenly saying that it's not interested in direct talks with the US, which seems to suggest indirect talks, and then perhaps a role from someone else, because of the change that has happened in the White House now. Russia has already been offering to mediate there.
No, I think Europe is watching very, very wearily at all this. I have to say they've never found themselves in such a pickle in terms of they have said no discussions on Ukraine without Ukraine, and they said no discussions on Europe without Europe. The fact of the matter is anything that is discussed in terms of a final agreement on Ukraine will have profound implications for the security architecture in Europe. So frankly, Europe will actually be watching this with great nervousness and angst. That is point number one. Point number two, a number of meetings are planned in both Paris and London. President Macron has called for a meeting of the European leaders on 27th in Paris, and day after tomorrow, I believe there is also a meeting in London.
Yes.
These talks are meant to concentrate on two objectives. One, Europe is trying to see if it can handle its defense without the United States, at least over a period of 5 years. And second, Europe is already preparing to actually have a coalition of the willing among some European countries, which will then put boots on the ground. And interestingly, I've also read a report which says the Chinese may be willing to put boots on the ground because that would make it more acceptable to the Russians. So there are lots of talks outside Riyadh as well. In Riyadh, you have talks between the Russian delegation, American delegation, and separately Ukrainian delegation and the US delegation. But what is also going on in Europe, in both London and Paris, is actually talks which are aimed at post-temporary ceasefire, when there will be discussions in London and Paris about how to keep the peace and how to maintain the peace in Ukraine.
Yes, a very intricate web being weaved, and we don't know what will really emerge as to who might get trapped and who might make a good meal for themselves. We'll have to wait and see what happens. Thanks a lot for joining us for the moment, Ambassador Mohan Kumar.